And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And my guest for this show, a return guest, is Lawrence Wilkerson. He was Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary. It's great to have you back. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
So,
I always like to come to Pacifica. Usually it's with Ian McMaster.
Well, I'm glad you're here too. So it's been a while. Before Trump was the last time I had you on my show. So what have you been up to lately? I think there's a project you're involved with, the Transition Integrity Project. But what have you been up to?
Basically, that's it. Three groups, actually. The National Task Force on Election Crises, which has been meeting since midsummer of last year, 2019. The Transition Integrity Project, which has been meeting since about December, but formally January. And then the Silver Linings Group out of New York. Each one has a bit of a different objective. The National Task Force is looking at, in a transpartisan way, everything to do with the 3 November elections with the objective of free and fair elections. The Transition Project is looking at from when a winner is declared or not declared up to the day of a new president by mandate, 20 January. Either Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, or some elected official. And looking at what might happen in that some 75 days. And then the Silver Linings Group right now is lining up sports coliseum and arenas all over the United States and similar things like the Amway building in Orlando, Florida, for safe centers for massive voting, in-person voting. Louisville did it with its convention center. It was a great success. 300 spaces for voting, each one wiped down between individual voters, distancing in the lines and so forth. These large areas give you the opportunity to do that. And while people in Kentucky said, oh, it won't work, it won't, no one will come there. They had lines all day long and people came from as far as 120 miles away in order to vote in a safe environment.
I would imagine that one of the challenges is getting people to work at the polls at places like that.
Absolutely. One of the lessons we learned from Wisconsin, for example, at the National Task Force was you had Milwaukee with over 800, I believe, 900 polling places, the area around Milwaukee. And all of a sudden it was 15 because most of the 65 and year older poll workers didn't come to the polls. So one of the lessons we came from that, of course, was, and we've got a massive program all across the country now, train young people to be poll workers. At my school, for example, we have had more than sufficient young people volunteer at William and Mary to go through the training, to get certified by the precincts, and to be poll workers.
And the people are paid for that too.
Yes, yes.
Not much, but they're paid.
Yeah, and fortunately, in most places, they were smart. They stayed away.
Well, but the talk is, Steve, what's his name? Steve Bannon, he's saying, well, the election is based on what happens on the night of the election. And the people who go to the polls and vote behind the curtains, they're the ones who decide the president. All the other stuff is nonsense.
It's pure hogwash.
Of course it is, but, it's why I'm going to go vote. I'm not going to send.
Well, I am too. I'm going to vote early because Virginia now, very smartly and wisely, has almost no excuse early absentee voting. So I can go right over here to my library, for example, on 14 October and cast my ballot. That's the way I've been voting for the last couple of years. It's not quite as safe because there is a short line there, but it's not very long. And generally speaking, you can distance, and most people, I'm amazed at what I'm seeing around me in Virginia. It's just a testimony to Fairfax County in particular, where there's something 60% of the people have masters or PhDs, and almost 80% have college degrees. So everyone's masked. Everyone's doing social distancing. They're doing what they should do.
Yeah, well, this nonsense that it takes away people's freedom. I wrote an article the other day. I turned onto Route 1, which is a 12-lane highway, and they took away my right to drive fast. And they took away my right to go through a light. And
exactly.
And then, I'm supposed to wear a seatbelt. Oh my God, my constitutional rights have been exploited. It's ridiculous. It's such nonsense.
I usually look at someone unmasked and say something like, being masked protects you, not me. So you're not protecting me. You're thoughtless.
Yeah. Well, it's become very politicized.
Yep.
So what do you think of the virus? What do you think about what's going on with it? How it happened? What's being done with it? How Trump and his administration have responded to it? Did the Chinese start it? Was it started? There are people who say it was started as some kind of way to take over the world or flip the switch.
There are people who say a plane didn't hit the side of the Pentagon too. And one of my dear friends said that recently, and you would not have believed the emails that came into her, including from people who were driving beneath the belly of that plane on the highway when it hit the Pentagon. So you're always going to have these conspiracy theories. I was very fortunate in that right after 9/11, I was put through a series of briefings that scared the bejesus out of me. They essentially were from Johns Hopkins virologists, epidemiologists, chemical warfare, biological warfare experts on what was the potential of terrorists to kill Americans with chemical and biological weapons, including germs. I met a gentleman there at that time. He was quite young then, but very astute, very capable, clearly going to be a leader in his field, if not already. He now is all of that. And he's advising the National Task Force. And while he might be a little bit dismal in his predictions, I tend to, as a military professional, I tend to listen to the dismal projections when they come from experts, especially scientists, and to worst case things. That's the way we always planned in the military, for the worst case. That way, if something middle ground happens, you're ready. But if the worst case happens and you're not ready, you're screwed. So, and he's saying right now, he's telling us, we haven't seen the worst. The worst is going to come over the next 3 or 4 months. We're probably going to be at 400,000, maybe even 500,000 by Christmas, deaths in this country. This is just an incredibly spread. He puts it this way: there's no infectious rate of anything we've seen in the past like this. It's not that lethal. It's only about 1 to 2% lethal. Take Ebola Zaire, for example, the Powell virus. It came out of the Philippines back some years ago when Powell was chairman and I was working for him. And we had a real scare in the country. 88% lethality. 88% demonstrated lethality. We had Fort Detrick working on that 24/7 trying to deal with it, because had it broken out, it would have been a disaster, clearly. Well, this one has an incredible infection rate. He says globally it may infect 60 to 80% of the population, but it only kills about 1 to 2. But do the math on that. 7-8 billion people, 1 or 2% is a hell of a lot of people. And in the United States, where we're doing the absolute worst of any large country, it could be considerable. And we have a president who seems to completely disregard that. I mean, I understand a very cold rationale for doing that. If, on the other hand, you were saying, no, we got to save the economy, so we're going to let these people die. You could be that cold and that ruthless, and it would be, nonetheless, a logical decision. That's not how I see him making this decision to let people die. I see it being cold and ruthless, basically to benefit Donald Trump, and not any aspect of the economic structure. So I'm really worried about this. I'm worried about what I'm being advised might happen between now and Christmas.
Well,
where did it come from? Even he does not know. But he says, judging from, and here, this guy's an expert, and so is the virologist that I've talked to at William Mary, who helps me with my simulations on this very pandemic. I did a simulation with my students. They all say the structure of this virus is such that it was not man-made. And I trust Michael in this regard, because he's seen the worst that we have man-made, the Russians have man-made, and to a certain extent the Chinese. At one point in time, we were actually doing this stuff with a vengeance in the United States, making these things. There are signatures, and he says this one simply has nature's signature, as indecipherable as some aspects of it still are, rather than man's signature. And I have no expertise to confront that or to confute it. I think he's probably, I trust him. I trust science.
Now, but there are all these theories out there, all these conspiracy theories. You've got QAnon. I mean, conspiracy theories have become a bigger phenomenon, I think, now than maybe in previous history. I mean,
that's a strong statement because we've really had a lot of them over time.
Yeah.
But you're right. And I think it's a part of the lack, and it's a statement on lack of education and a statement on the poor quality of education offered the masses in this country. And I don't see, here's your conspiracy theory. I don't see that as being a happen chance. I don't think our education, especially our public education system, deteriorated so much because we just let it do so. I think we had some oligarchs in this country who were intent on it doing so, because fundamentally, you don't want a smart electorate in a democracy. You want people whom you can make slaves of. You want people who won't question authority. You want people who will work for $5 an hour. You want people who will accept the drudge and the dreariness of the life you offer them as you make billions and billions of dollars. Never in the history of this country has the maldistribution of wealth been as obscene and profane as it is today. It's worse right now than in 1929.
Frank Zappa said that the most common thing in the universe is not hydrogen, it's stupidity.
I'll go along with that.
And back around 2000, Michael Moore wrote a book, Stupid White Men. You've said we're some of the dumbest animals on the face of the earth. You want to care to expound on that?
Well, I go along with what another scientist said to me recently. He said, we're the first generation, and not talking about any specific generation, just people living today. We're the first people, humans, to know that we're destroying ourselves. We have the science to know that, and to know that we have the science to remedy that, at least to a degree of survivability. And yet we're doing nothing. And that's the definition of utter stupidity. You're killing yourself. And you're doing it in the name of mammon and money and more money and growth and economic structures that defy reality anymore, that build no resilience, that destroy the environment, rather than the opposite. It's clear that we have to do things differently, and yet we're not.
Well, but a lot of the people who are supporting the politicians who don't protect the environment, who don't think about the future of the planet, those people are not really doing it for the money. They're doing it because they're embracing social issues, like, let's say, anti-abortion. And they get stuck on that issue, so they end up going along on the politics of the people who, at the same time, are going to exploit.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are some really hot button issues like abortion, like the death penalty, like socialism. Most Americans couldn't even define socialism if you gave them a week in an Oxford English dictionary, nor could they define communism, nor for that matter, could they define capitalism. So they're talking about things that they don't even know about. They're like trains passing in the night with no noise and no sight of one another. There's nothing to what they argue about except ramifying, making more rigid their own beliefs, which are all preconceived notions, like the ones you just spoke of. Now, here you got people who say, I don't believe a woman should have a choice. I don't believe, and don't parse it at all, trimester or wherever. I don't believe a woman should have a choice. I believe that baby should live. But I'm not going to take care of that baby once it's born. That baby's on its own. That's God's will. That baby's on its own. And these same people will tell you, yes, I'm for the death penalty. Kill that bastard. Even though we have clear evidence all across the country from every court in the land that we err as often as we succeed in terms of turning in a verdict that might lead to capital punishment. I mean, DNA has proven that in spades over the last decade. So, I mean, I don't get these people. They're not geniuses. You know, genius is someone who can hold two violently even opposed ideas in his head at the same time and not go crazy. These people can do that with a dozen ideas and not go crazy, but it's not genius that's causing them to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, I recently had John Dean on, and he wrote a book about authoritarians, and he characterizes Trump supporters as authoritarians. And that's basically what he says about them. He says that they can entertain these different ideas because they really don't think about them.
I think that's the scariest aspect of what I'm seeing with things like the simulations, the papers called them war games, that we did with the Transition Integrity Project, TIP. I'm seeing that there are a lot of people out there who are supportive of Trump, not because of what he says or does, though that titillates them from time to time. They're supportive of him because he promises them to end democracy and the confusion and the turmoil of democracy. He promises to bring them stability. He promises, like a king, a dictator, to bring them continuity and stability. And as long as they can survive under that, and it's less instability in their lives than democracy brings, they're happy about that. They are the most scary portion of the group that we call Trump's base, in my view, because many times they can intellectualize this. It's the same as with many of the Germans in 1933 and 34. Now, you had Prussians who were clearly education-wise, intelligence-wise, aristocracy-wise, the elite in Germany at that time, who went along with Hitler's rise simply because they kept telling themselves, he's stupid. We can deal with him. And when the time comes, we will deal with him. And many of them were the leaders of the Wehrmacht, the military leaders in Germany. You saw how that turned out.
Yeah. So who are these people? You just said the ones that concern you the most are these people who are willing to buy giving up democracy in order for security, basically.
Let me give an example of one. He's a lawyer. He probably makes somewhere between $1 million and $2 million a year, has been doing so for some time. And he's very much a Trump fan. And when you parse him and you try to find out why, it has nothing to do with some of these issues that you and I were just talking about. It has everything to do with the fact he's cut taxes and he's made this guy have to pay a lot less of his, quote, hard-earned money, unquote, to the government. And he promises more of the same. And so this guy's with him for life, because as long as he keeps the taxes down and he can make more obscene wealth, that's fine with him.
And to me, that makes sense. I mean,
yeah.
not morally,
it's logical.
It makes sense that that kind of a person would support Trump.
Yeah.
But most of Trump's supporters are these less than college educated white men over 50. That's his biggest base.
You're right. But some of the most powerful and most instrumental to his maintaining power are the billionaires that are behind him. And I think that's their principal reason for being behind him. Plus, some of them, like Charles Koch, others of Charles Koch's ilk, Robert Mercer, Sheldon Adelson, but that's got a special, role there with Netanyahu in Israel. But they're for this autocracy too, because, and I think Barr is of this type too, the Attorney General, because they see democracy as having failed. They see it as having turned the American experiment, which was white and male and landed and aristocratic, into a maelstrom of the mob. They will quote to you, Bannon will quote to you often about the mob. He'll quote Jefferson on the mob. You don't want the mob. The mob is Ocasio-Cortez. The mob is all those blacks in New York and San Francisco and Detroit and Minneapolis. The mob.
BLM.
Yeah, that's the mob. You don't want that taking over, and the only way you can stop it is with a tyrant who's willing to do it. We forget the derivation of that word. The Greeks coined that word for the man whom, in peril, like Pericles, they would call in and he would temporarily take over, bring stability, defeat the enemy, and then leave. Often they didn't leave, but that's what you were supposed to do. Cincinnatus being the most famous one, they did leave, went back to his farm. So tyrant is an operative term in politics if you understand the derivation. You bring in the tyrant fixes all your problems. Your problems are blacks, Hispanics, Arabs, anybody who doesn't look white and male. And if you're a woman, you got to be following a white male, as the Bible says you should do. And you end the problems. That's what a lot of these people, I think, ultimately see in Donald Trump. And of course, the fundamentalist Christians will tell you, as some have told me right to my face, Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump are constructing the ground in Israel for the rapture. And when the rapture comes, Christ will descend with his flaming sword, kill all the unbelievers. It doesn't matter that Jews are unbelievers. We're sending money for West Bank settlements, but we know those people will be dead when Christ is done with his flaming sword.
There's an old Outer Limits show where these aliens come and they bring this book, and it's how to serve man. And I always said that this is what the Jews in Israel are doing. They would get in the show, the people would go back to the planet with these aliens because the aliens wanted to serve man. And at the end, they finally translate the book, and it's a cookbook. and these rapture people, they're basically, they're embraced. There are over 70 million Christian Zionists, and the mostly the Orthodox Jews embrace them. They think they're great, but really they're planning for the doom and the end of the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. It's such ignorance, really.
I remember vividly when Max Blumenthal was in Max's younger days, when he was at a John Hagee conference that featured Christians for Israel.
He's the big.
And Max walked up and, without Hagee understanding who he was or what he was doing, asked him if he hadn't written in his book that all the unbelievers would die when Christ came back for the rapture, and weren't the Jews unbelievers? And Hagee looked at him and said, "Who are you? How dare you quote that from my book? Here I am with all these Israelites around me, and I'm supposed to be saying that all the Jews are going to die?" No, I didn't say that. It was a vivid moment. Then, to make it even worse, Max goes out and sticks his microphone in Tom DeLay's face. Remember the hammer? Tom DeLay from the Congress?
Yeah, the exterminator.
And he says to DeLay, he says, "Are you longing for the rapture?" Yes. "Well, you're here with a lot of people who are Jewish Americans. Do you realize they're going to die at the rapture?" And DeLay looks confounded for only a moment. And he comes back with, "Oh, they'll convert at the last minute." This is on camera.
Yeah. And I think Israel is one of the most influential players in American politics.
Absolutely.
But now I'm Jewish. I'm saying it. You're not Jewish, I don't think.
No, I'm not. No. But
so you're going to be,
I've been called an anti-Semite, but I assure you I'm not.
Saying that, and the crew has said that, and they've been accused of anti-Semitism because they say that Israel attempts to influence American politics. And I believe it does it more than any other country at all, period.
You're absolutely right. Russia and China and Iran pale in terms of their influence on our political process to Israel. Israel has maximum influence on our political. Who else comes, their prime minister, to a joint session of Congress and criticizes the sitting president of the United States before a joint session of Congress? I mean, you can't beat influence like that.
Yeah. And like Trump, he's been indicted for criminal activity.
Yep.
So we need to take a quick show ID. We'll take 20 seconds for a break here. And my guest for this show is Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the chief of staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. So I wanted to get a little more into the Transition Integrity Project. You're kind of wargaming it and predicting what will happen after November 3rd. What are you coming up?
I wouldn't call it predicting. I mean, I've done this all my military career, some 30 odd years. We're showing insights, I think. That's the best way to phrase it. We're demonstrating insights into what might happen. And the way we did that was we got Republicans and Democrats, very, very high level ones in some cases. I can name a couple. Former Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, Bill Kristol, whom I'm sure you know, David Frum, political operatives, former Chief of Staff John Podesta at the White House, and so forth, to play the Democratic team, and similar types to play the Republican team. And we put over that a chapeau of federal government agency, department controllers, court, including the Supreme Court and so forth, that might influence. And then we rolled a die with 12 numbers for fate, because you got to have some kind of fateful decisions in the game. You know, when people were disagreeing in the control group as to who would win in a particular move, out went the die. And then you know, die would come up and you'd say, oh, they lost and they won. So you have to introduce some randomness into it. And our scenarios were, as you might imagine, things like Biden blowout, Electoral College and popular vote, Trump blowout, very indecisive election, can't determine who's won in the Electoral College or the popular vote, ongoing trial, or not trials, but ongoing legal disputes, as we had in Florida in 2000, but in 7 or 8 different states. A state like Pennsylvania, where you have a governor of one party and a legislature of the other party, both deciding to send different slates of electors to Washington, one for one candidate, one for another candidate. All kinds of problems happen in these elections that are very, very close, or even you might call them like 1876, a hung election. You may be familiar with that Tilden.
That's where it went to the Congress, and the Congress decided to hand it to the guy who had lost the vote.
You actually had Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes both planning their inaugurations at the same time. They both said they had won. And the deal, of course, was Tilden gave in and said, if you will, as your first major act as president, end Reconstruction in the South and put blacks back into economic slavery for 100 years, you know, I'll give in to you. And Hayes agreed and became president and ended Reconstruction. So it wasn't a very good decision for blacks. It was a terrible decision.
Yeah, and that's what Trump is starting to talk about doing, trying to send the election into the House.
Yeah, where unfortunately, one of the things I discovered in particular, because I thought I knew the Constitution pretty well with regard to military power and wars, I think I do, but I didn't know how many big holes there are in it, big enough to drive a Mack truck through with regard to our elections. They're all in the hands of the states. The federal government has almost nothing to do with these elections. They're all in the states. So other than the deadlines like 20 January and 6 January and 14 December and so forth for electoral college slates, for the safe haven period to end, for the inauguration to occur and so forth, the federal government doesn't do much about it. It's all in the states, and it's all to precincts. And that's one thing we have focused on in the National Task Force. We give things to the secretaries of state in the states, but we really want them to trickle down. And if they don't, in some cases they don't, we trickle them ourselves down to the precincts so that they understand things like you need to train and certify younger poll workers, or things like when you see the National Guard show up at the polling place, tell them to go away, you know, start a legal case, we'll help you. There are all kinds of things that can happen down at the precincts that most Americans would never see unless they were in Texas, or they were in Florida, or they were in Pennsylvania, or they were in Wisconsin.
And so if let's say Biden wins, it's possible that a Republican legislature or governor cannot certify things, and that ends up so that state's electoral votes would not go at all to anybody.
That might be the outcome. And that, unfortunately, would actually be an outcome that probably might be contested in court, but wouldn't be decided in court. Whereas if they decided to send two, or they decided to defy the popular vote and send an opposite slate of electors, that'd probably go to court and lose. Even with the Supreme Court, I don't think Justice Roberts would let that happen in the Supreme Court. So there are scenarios, though, that could happen that don't have a legal alternative. They just are there. And what will probably happen because of the compressed time frame is the Senate, the vice president as head of the Senate, or even the court, or all might say, okay, forget you, you're out. And in most cases, because we did gain this insight vividly, it is really helpful to be the incumbent. You own all the levers of power. So most of the time, that's going to be resolved in favor of the guy who owns the departments, owns the Justice Department, owns the government. And that's a sad thing, because it might be very much against the popular vote.
Well, the popular vote hasn't really worked well for the Democrats in recent years.
And we should have done something about it. But one of the things standing in the way is the Republicans. Here's something I told I'm a Republican. I told the National Task Force, as we debated what our words would be early in mid 2019, and we decided it would be free and fair elections the majority of America accepts as legitimate. That would be our purpose, if you will. And I said, okay, just one point. I want to remind you, I was one of the few Republicans there. I want to remind you that in at least 9 states, and probably more, I know personally there are people sitting around in a room just like this one with the objective of not having free and fair elections. That's what you're up against, because they know that if there were free and fair elections, they would never get office again.
You're talking about Republicans.
Yeah. Look at the demographics of this country. If you had a free and fair election with nothing interposing except the vote, Republicans would never win again.
You mean nothing like voter ID and taking people off of voter rolls and gerrymandering?
Exactly.
And all kinds of ridiculous money going into elections?
Some legal and some extra legal and some not legal. Yeah.
So you're a Republican, but you're a kind of an archaic Republican.
There are a few of us, and believe it or not, in the States, there are lots of us who are 40 and under. I was just in Idaho, for example, right before the COVID pandemic closed in, a meeting with a whole group of them, young people, 38 to 42, financiers, landowners, bankers, real estate people. I mean, they're sick and tired of the people in Boise, utterly disgusted with them, mainly over clean water, which they see as one of Idaho's great attributes, fishing, another great attribute, hunting, another great attribute, and public lands and access there too. Half of Idaho, no more than half, is public lands. They hate the Republicans in Boise because they're destroying all of that. And so one of these days, they're going to kick them out because they're the wave of the future, not the people in Boise. But it's going to take a while.
It's if the planet can survive, really.
Yes, that big question.
So the Transition Integrity Project, you've come up with some possible scenarios that are pretty scary. Tell us about some of them.
They all involve, more or less, a Trump decision that if he lets it go on and lets it be adjudicated in accordance with the normal procedures, he's going to lose. And so the responses range from the most dire of all, where he simply does what he does at some of his rallies, but more powerfully, he calls his base to the streets and either hints at or says directly, bring your guns. Most of the guns in America, now 400 million of them, are in the hands of Trump's base. FBI estimates somewhere between 70 and 75%. And that is the worst scenario, because if they come to the streets with their guns in any numbers, it'll probably be in the medium to larger size metropolitan areas. You've seen a little bit of it in places like Oregon and Minnesota, Michigan.
Kenosha,
yeah. And we feel like, and in these exercises, it was demonstrated that we had a good insight. The opposite will have twice the number, maybe even more than that, but they'll come to the street without guns. It'll be nonviolent. There were some people who thought the left had some, elements that might be violent too. I don't doubt that. They probably do, but I think it's vastly outnumbered by the people on the right. After all, I watched Charlottesville pretty closely. I watched Richmond pretty closely when they surrounded Governor Northam with guns. And we were just very fortunate that didn't turn violent. I think they're mostly there. So if he asks his base to come to the streets with their guns, then we've got a significant problem, because we think the left will turn out in much greater numbers, but they won't be armed. So what happens when they meet in the streets?
It's scary.
Yep.
It's scary. And
yeah, I think there are some about 4 or 5 months ago, Sidney Blumenthal let me know that he was finishing up his volumes on Lincoln. I think he's already done a couple. And I said, well, I'm looking at the period 1850 to 1860, and then 1866 to 1876, particularly beginning with the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And he said, let me give you some books. So I read about a dozen and a half books on that period. And one of the things that struck me was how eerily like today that period was. 1850 to 1860 in particular. That
was the run up to the Civil War.
Yes. A very powerful minority had hijacked all three branches of government in every respect. The presidency in the respect of, I ain't going to do anything about this. No way. The Congress in the sense that they dominated it. And the Supreme Court in the sense that the Supreme Court was imbalanced toward the South. So you had a similar situation where all three of the founders' elements of checks and balances were essentially captured by or contaminated by or complicit with this tyranny of the minority. That's what we have today. And you also have, and I said this, a year and a half ago, people call me a rabid, Republicans in particular call me a rabid reprobate or something like that, because I said, all the racists in America of consequence are in my political party. Dick Nixon's Southern strategy was to get them and bring them over into the Republican Party, and he did it. And now they've flooded into Pennsylvania. The joke about Pennsylvania is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Alabama in between. And they're in Indiana, they're in Ohio, they're in Wisconsin, they're in Minnesota, and so forth. And these people are, in essence, racist. They believe in white supremacy, if not overtly, certainly in their heart and soul. And they compose a good measure of Trump's base. And now people are saying to me, you were right about all those racists being in your party. Yeah, okay.
So I have a couple more questions for you. One is, you talk about the violence, and it's mostly on the right. What about Antifa? I mean, I consider them the boogeymen of Trump and Barr and that conversation on Fox News, for example. What's your take on Antifa?
I don't know them that well. I don't know their leadership. I don't know how they're constituted in terms of cells and so forth. I do know that was amongst the experts that we did have on the tip. That was their concern with regard to violence from that particular part of the political spectrum, was Antifa, and they would put it Antifa and similar elements.
Okay. And another question, Mike Pompeo. You've been up close to seeing a Secretary of State at work. What's your take on him?
As a diplomat, a total failure. As a pursuer of Iran and policy there toward, a total failure. As a practitioner of North Korean policy, a total failure. I can't tell you a single thing that Pompeo has been successful at, except, and this is a major bureaucratic achievement, carrying his clandestine operations as CIA director into the State Department, and not only continuing and intensifying them, but convincing his buddy over on the Hill, Mitch McConnell, to give him money to pay for them, taxpayer dollars to pay for them. So let me give you a perfect example. As CIA director, he was running a disinformation campaign against Iran. Okay, fine, you want to run it in. Now, as Secretary of State, he moves money into the State Department's coffers, courtesy Mitch and his boys. And then that money is not just used for a disinformation campaign against Iran, but completely illegally in terms of domestic law, he turns that money into publicity for Trump inside the United States with regard to Iran. In other words, he makes Trump's policies with regard to Iran, which are his policies as Secretary of State, he makes them look positive to Americans using money he got for disinformation against Iran. That's illegal. That's completely illegal. It was illegal as director of the CIA had he turned it on America. But once he did it as the Secretary of State, it was doubly illegal because he used money coming to CIA for state purposes, and he used it for purposes that are illegal, propagandizing the American people on behalf of a particular political candidate. There's a reason he's the first Secretary of State, as far as I know in our history, to practice politics for the incumbent president.
So I interviewed Joseph Nye, who wrote the book on soft power and the future of power. And basically, the State Department is about soft power. The State Department is where we attempt to get things done without using money or weapons or threats or violence. Is Pompeo doing anything with that? How is Trump when it comes to thinking about getting things done in the world without spending money or throwing around hard power?
I was impressed in 2015 and then in 2016 with Trump's remarks about ending stupid wars. And his citation of the 2003 invasion of Iraq as an example was right up my alley. And I even toyed with the prospect of casting my vote for him because I saw Hillary Clinton as a warmonger. She made one of the most impolitic remarks in diplomatic history. We came, we saw, and he died, referring to Muammar Gaddafi. Gruesome death in an intervention that even President Obama told me personally that he was sorry he agreed to in the Roosevelt room in November of 2015. He started that conversation with these words. This is a direct quote. "There is a bias in this town toward war." Didn't think I'd ever hear a sitting president admit that.
Wow.
But I did. So, it's a peculiar aspect of our democracy. I just wrote this in a critique of my students' presentation last week on the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. I said, it's a curious thing about our democracy. Look at John Foster Dulles, look at George Shultz, look at Mike Pompeo, look at Hillary Clinton, that often when the president brings his National Security Council together or principals meeting to discuss the use of force, the Secretary of State, the diplomat, is the most adamant about using force. And the Secretary of Defense and the military are the most reluctant to do so. Really? Not always the case, but the case enough to make the point.
That seems like it should almost be a criteria for not appointing somebody.
Bingo. It says we failed majorly in interpreting the diplomatic instrument to a whole generation of people. It's not about hard power, it's about soft power. That's why you see today, 4.5 billion people in polls say the number one threat to their future and their children's future is the United States of America.
Yes. Yeah. So much for American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Yes, it is the number one threat.
Yeah.
So we need to take another quick break, and we'll take 20 seconds and be back. Okay. And my guest for this show is Lawrence Wilkerson. He was Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's a distinguished adjunct professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. You've said that you think if Biden is elected and takes the presidency in January, that he's going to face an economic situation that might be worse than the Great Depression.
I think so. My brief consultations, such as they are with investment bankers and others, and emails that pour into me every day that I have to, I really have to decipher and move the wheat over here and the chaff over here, because you never know what's coming into you. And then you look up the bona fides of the people who are sending it to you, and you can judge a little bit. But there's a body out there of people all across the globe, but particularly people in Europe and people in Japan who are very worried, for example, about the dollar as the transactional and reserve currency of the world, and giving us enormous power, enormous power. Charles de Gaulle once said the most pernicious weapon America exercised was the power of the dollar. And of course, Eisenhower got the British and the French to leave Suez in '56 because he threatened to run on the pound at the IMF. That was really what broke their backs. So if that were to happen, I'm not sure Americans understand how dramatically their lives would change. Inflation would go off the charts. We would no longer be able to deflate our debt instantly because we enumerated in dollars. We'd have to do it in renminbi or some other currency that would take the dollar's role, or in chaos, which might be even worse because no currency would be triumphant. I won't ask you to remember, back in the early days of this republic, you could spend Spanish doubloons, English pounds. You could spend any currency in this country because there was no standardization. And it sort of worked because we were pioneers. We were on a frontier. We chopped down trees and shot deer to eat, and so forth and so on. And we had slaves making cotton and growing rice and so forth to sell for real currency. But the real currency wasn't ours. It was British pounds or some other currency. That's a very chaotic situation to be in, even when you're young and growing up, as it were. But it's tremendously chaotic situation to be in if you're grown completely accustomed to dominating the world, to sanctioning everybody in the world, and to being able to get away with it. Because even your allies who don't agree with you have to go along with it because you'll sanction them too. By the way, under international law, that's warfare. That's economic warfare. So any of these countries has a right to bomb us back if they wanted to under international law, because you can't do this sort of thing unless you have the power of your currency. You don't find anybody else in the world doing this sort of thing. The British used to do it when they had the pound dominating everybody. So I'm worried about that. I'm really worried about that. The shock it's going to bring when the Chinese and the Russians, who are beavering away in the trenches right now, succeed. And we wake up one morning and the dollar is no longer triumphant. The second thing I'm really worried about is what China's doing with the Space Road Initiative. It's three-pronged now. It's running through Central Asia. It's a maritime part that runs around India, the subcontinent, around Iran, through the Suez. The Red Sea is a new cockpit of strategic confrontation now, not the Persian Gulf. Persian Gulf is receding into the mist of Mike Pompeo's dreams. The Red Sea is the real place. Something like 40 to 60% of China's goods pass through the Red Sea. On Djibouti alone are the Italians, the French, the Chinese, the Japanese, the US, all with military installations, ships in that Red Sea every day. How many Americans even know that? How much American media pays attention to that? No, because they haven't a clue. But that's what's happening in the world right now. And we're going to wake up and China's going to say, bye, so long, just the way we did to Britain. It's the nature of things.
And Trump is certainly creating an adversarial situation with China.
Yes, he's perturbating it. It's of much concern to me that he thinks his October surprise might be Iran, or it might be Korea or Venezuela. More likely, he's going to be surprised. This business of clarity with regard to Taiwan and sending a ministerial level person to Taipei which is a violation of our agreement with China that is longstanding now, and the Chinese military. The stark difference between the Chinese military when Richard Haas and I went to China in the summer of 2001 and talked with the Chinese, and now blows me away. There are Chinese admirals, there were Chinese admirals at that time who would say, not publicly, but they would say, we don't mind the US 7th Fleet being in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea or in the Pacific. We don't mind that because we are economic. We want our economy to prosper. And you give us some safety at sea. You protect our commerce too. So we're not. Now they're saying, these admirals are saying, their descendants are saying, we want to sink a couple of US aircraft carriers, and by God, we can do it. And you send them into the Strait. Notice we have not sent an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait since Bill Clinton sent one in 1998. We have not done it. The Chinese are going to sink one or two or three. They can do it easily. Aircraft carriers, it's gone. It's finished its utility, except for attacking African coastal countries and bombarding the hell out of Iraq or Iran or something like that. But in terms of fighting a first-rate power like Russia or China, aircraft carriers are going to sink 5,000 souls.
They're obsolete, you're saying?
Yeah, they're obsolete. In a high-tech war, they're obsolete.
Well, what is the cutting edge of military power and war now?
Truth be told, I'm almost convinced now that it's getting inside your enemy's networks and destroying them. And that doesn't take anything but what's being called cyber warfare. And interestingly, it takes a high school student who sits at his desk and drinks Coke and gets fat and is incredibly expert at hacking and that sort of thing, to be trained into the process of doing it against another state or states and doing it extremely well. And of course, they got to have the equipment.
And I would imagine that it could be incredibly powerful. I mean, the idea that they could take down the power grid in a big section of the United States, or they could knock out communications among satellites, so that cell phones stopped working. I mean,
that's the future. That's the future.
It is bigger, and it's bigger than a nuclear bomb, really.
In the sense of its ultimate devastation and the dramatic impact psychologically it might have on your enemy, yes. I mean, if you get a barrage of nuclear weapons hit you, you're dead. You're either dead from the blast or you're dead from the residual radiation. But this, it leaves you intact, and basically your systems are intact. They just don't work.
And you're back in the 17th century.
Yes. Yeah.
So you've said that you think that if Republicans ram through a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it might hurt them.
I think ultimately, in our system, and I have to preface this by saying, if we're still here, in our system, the pendulum swings. It swings slowly, but it swings decisively. And I think the Republicans right now, from Mitt Romney to Mitch McConnell to Lindsey Graham to Susan Collins, are cutting their own throat. I think they're committing suicide. Colin Powell said to the RNC some years ago, if you don't open your tent and let in all manner of sexual orientation, sex in general, women, men, Blacks, Latinos, all Americans, if you don't open your tent, you're doomed. He was right. The only way they're keeping their doom away at arm's length right now is cheating, using all the vicissitudes in our electoral system and doing some illegal things too. I think I know how Karl Rove won Ohio, for example, in 2004. The Democrats figured it out, cheated back, and so they won it the next time around. And that had to do with hacking and picking precincts where the difference was just barely there, so no one would check afterwards, and you shift 50,000 votes inside a computer system, and all of a sudden you've won. And no one disputes it because it's only 50,000 votes in 2.5 million. That's the way we started cyber warfare in terms of politics in this country. And it's still ongoing, of course. But now we have more safeguards against it. But that's how the Republicans are going to have to maintain power. And that's not sustainable. I don't think.
Bill Moyers years ago, maybe 15 or more years ago, said there's a class war underway and we're losing. And what you just described is politics warfare.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I don't think you can, I don't, I think it was Socrates who said all life is politics, however the Greek translates, but I don't think you can avoid the two being commingled. It's just, you can do it theoretically if you're a professor in a classroom, but in the real world, they commingle all the time.
Yeah, it's true. You were given the Sam Adams Award, which is given to people in the whistleblower community. What's your take on the current situation for whistleblowers in general, specific whistleblowers, Assange, for example?
Every American should read Tom Mueller's book, Crisis of Conscience, 2019, I think. Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. I talked to Random House, I believe it was, right afterwards, because they had sent me a copy of the book to review. And I said, how are sales going? And they said, well, they're not so good. And I talked to Tom, and Tom said, not so good. Although he went all over the country in a book tour. And I concluded the reason, and I told Tom this, and I told Random House this too. I said, Americans don't want to hear this. They don't want to hear that President Obama, for example, persecuted whistleblowers with a vengeance.
He prosecuted more whistleblowers than all past presidents combined.
Yep.
That was the reason I decided I couldn't vote for him in 2012.
And they don't want to hear also, and this, Tom, is 55, 56 pages in detail about, that Hanford Nuclear Complex out on the Columbia River, under Bechtel cooperation and a complicity between Bechtel, Department of Justice, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense, is very lax to the extent that we're going to have a Chernobyl times 10 or maybe times 100 on the Columbia River in the Western United States sooner or later, because they are doing nothing really to monitor and control in a safe way the incredible nuclear waste that's built up there. Now, I've had an opportunity to talk to two of the individuals who are billionaires with regard to their waste management, and waste management mostly of nuclear waste out west. And I've sort of suggested some of this to them, and they have not denied it. In fact, I think I can say fairly that there's an intimation there that we're doing something about it. But if you read Mueller's book, if you read those pages, and it's not just the nuclear crisis, it's all manner of pollution and corruption in government, and you read what they're doing to the whistleblowers in this situation, it's unique, because what's happening is a nuclear physicist, and you have to almost be a nuclear engineer, physicist, or something to understand this stuff. He sees it happening, she sees it happening, and goes to the IG, the Inspector General, or above them even, maybe to their actual management structure, and doesn't want to blow the whistle, just wants the situation they've found to be fixed. You get a complicity between justice, who will bring the case, energy, where nuclear weapons are managed, the military, very, very interested in nuclear weapons, and Bechtel, the usually guilty contractor, not living up to his contract. You get this complicity to make sure that whistleblower is either almost given a nuclear pill.
Well, that's what happens to whistleblowers. I mean, whistleblower, the goal of the company and the government is to destroy their lives in every way possible. Yeah. And I mean, Op-Ed News and we were given an award by the whistleblowers for supporting whistleblowers, and that's what a whistleblower should expect. To become a whistleblower, you have to almost decide you're going to sacrifice your life, and maybe not your breath, but the life you had. We've got to wrap. Any final words?
No, I'll just say that I had a student about a year and a half ago, very good student, write a directed independent study after reviewing all whistleblower law. And that's exactly what he said to me when he finished, what you just said.
Yeah, it's sad. It's really sad. My guest for this show has been Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he's his Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary. Thanks so much for being back on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.